now the podcast starts.
Hello, listener. Welcome back to the podcast on which we talk about horror. Sometimes we talk about other things, and sometimes we swear. This is TD Velasquez, but as always, you can call me Dan. I'm on my own at the minute, but I'll shortly be joined by the wonderful Stella, Dr. Stella Gaynor, that is, and we'll be having a discussion about body horror. Just before we go to that, though, I hope you had a nice Halloween. I did, and I didn't. I did because I went to a rather wonderful screening in Manchester of my perennial fave, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, followed by a screening of 28 Days Later. These were both at the Chapeltown Picture House in Manchester's Green Quarter, which is rather a nice venue. And I like both movies. Unfortunately, it was a very stormy, horrible, rainy, windy night in Manchester. I got absolutely soaked and have ended up with a bit of a cold, which you might be able to detect in my voice, although it's starting to abate, I think. Nevertheless, a nice evening, and especially nice to see 28 Days Later, which I failed to see on its initial release in cinemas 20 years ago. Even though I was a film student at the time who was a horror fan, I really should have gone to see it, but I didn't. So to finally see it on the big screen was good fun. And those of you who heard our previous episode in which we discussed the recent film Men, there's an interest among us in Alex Garland's work, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to see 28 Days Later again. And in fact, we will be going in depth on that movie later this series. So if you like that movie, there's something interesting coming up for you. Something else I have been doing over the Halloween period is watching the rather marvellous Blu-ray release by 101 Films of Ghostwatch. That wonderful 1992 BBC TV special, which long-time listeners of this podcast will know is a particular favourite of ours. And in fact, the Blu-ray features our very own Stella on the commentary with her colleague Dr. Shelley McMurdo. And it's a wonderful listen. The actual limited edition Blu-ray package is a wonderful thing, a joy to behold. It has treasures in it, including a printed booklet containing the complete shooting script, complete with annotations by the director Leslie Manning. It's an absolutely fantastic package, and really well worth your time. Brand new documentary on there as well, including contributions from people such as friends of the podcast, the writer of Ghostwatch, Stephen Volk, and also Rob Savage, director of Host. I can't recommend the Blu-ray enough to fans of Ghostwatch, and obviously I can't recommend Ghostwatch itself enough to anyone who might not have watched it yet. Definitely go for it. So that was my Halloween, but as I'm sure many of you listening will be intending to do, I really want to make Halloween last at least until Christmas, so I'm going to be continuing with my horror viewing, and of course that's why I'm here and why I'm privileged to be involved in a horror podcast where we just get to think a lot about that kind of material which thrills us so much. And having said that, let's move on to the topic of today's episode. So this episode was originally intended to be a questions of horror episode, and the question was going to be, what counts as body horror? Now I've actually decided to title the episode, as you'll probably have seen, a ramble about body horror, because although Stella and I started with that question, we kind of went on to just discuss our favourite and most interesting things about body horror, and also discuss the development of the form in terms of the technological development in cinema and makeup and things like that. So I don't think we really answered the question, so that's why I changed the title of the episode. But hopefully it will still be a very interesting discussion as well. We touch on quite a lot of movies and TV shows, and we probably give spoilers for a few of them, or at least for key moments. So I'll put a full list in the show notes of the films that we mention and discuss. So have a check of that before you listen, and make sure that you don't want, or you're happy to be spoiled, before you go in. So, having given you that warning, I shall hand over to Stella and the not cold afflicted version of myself from a couple of weeks ago when we recorded this, and hopefully it will be enjoyable to you. Alright, my friends, have fun. Hello, Stella.
Alright, Dan. It's been a while.
It has been a while. This is marvellous. Welcome back. Before we get into the main discussion, I just want to mention, and I put a link to this, but seeing as the last time I was talking to you on the podcast was when we recorded our Red Dwarf episode, I've now been delighted to discover that every episode almost of Red Dwarf is on UKTV Play for streaming.
Fantastic.
Because it's being shown on Yesterday channel on regularly. So every single episode is up there except for Series 9, which was Back to Earth.
That was the first one on Dave, wasn't it? Was it?
Yeah, I think it was, right. But I'm not sure if it was made by Dave. I think it might have been an independent production, which is why it's never been available as far as I can see on their streaming. But every other episode is there, all the BBC series and all the subsequent Dave series. So I shall certainly be filling those gaps that we discovered last time in my Red Dwarf adventuring. I was really pleased to discover that. Cheered me up no end.
Excellent. It's good stuff.
It is indeed. So, wonder if we'll bring any of that into today's discussion. So, maybe. I came up with a question of horror for today. The question being, what counts as body horror? Because I think that I have a tendency, and I think other people do as well, of kind of relating horror a lot to a particular era of cinema, like from the 80s onwards, or rather the 80s and the 90s, kind of pre-CGI, because that's when the makeup effects lent themselves to there being a lot of body horror, both in obviously in the mainstream of the horror genre, but also leaking out into other types of product, other genres, because these kind of visuals were suddenly possible when they hadn't been before. But I guess as a starting point for the discussion, I'll ask you, Stella, because you are a person as well as a great oracle of the horror genre in general. You have actual practical experience of the makeup side of things. What do you think of when somebody says body horror to you? What's like the first example that comes into your mind?
Oh God, there's a few actually, and it was quite interesting to pick them apart and separate them a bit to think about that question: what counts as body horror? And the first one that always jumps into my head isn't technically a horror film. We'd call it cyberpunk. So the film that always jumps first into my head is Tetsuo the Iron Man.
Okay.
Yeah, 1989. Just because it's a brutal film, and it's all the industrial mechanical noise in it, and you've got the lead character sort of grafting various bits of machines to his flesh. So there's just countless close-ups of various parts of this man's body as he tears himself open and puts various bits of wires inside himself, but it's all shot in black and white.
Yeah.
So it takes away that red, visceral thing that you might think of body horror. But my mind always goes back to Tetsuo the Iron Man.
Well, no, you know what? I've never seen that, and part of the reason is, apart from the fact that it's quite hard to get hold of, because the original Tetsuo is only about an hour long, isn't it? And it's a black and white film. The sequel, Tetsuo 2 Body Hammer, I think is the sequel.
Body
it's
Hammer.
Bigger budget and more available, and it kind of came out in the wake of Terminator 2, I think. So it was kind of more zeitgeisty. But Tetsuo has always freaked me out, the idea of it. It's a guy who, it's kind of Cronenbergian car crash. Is it a guy who's in a car crash and he then begins to turn into a car or something? I'm not sure.
Into a cyborg.
Right.
So it's a guy, he hits they run someone over, and then that just sends them mad, essentially. So the director, Sakamoto, I think is his name. I apologise if I'm butchering that. He famously said something on the lines of, he was very much influenced by lots of the 70s American horror, so Cronenberg stuff, like, and Nightmare on Elm Street he cited quite a lot as well in an interview with him. So there's lots of sequences in the film that are very clearly, there are body horror, cyberpunk, all that kind of stuff, but there's lots of it that feels like a slasher, because there's lots of extended chase sequences where you think they've got away from each other, because they're kind of chasing each other, the male and the female central character. So it feels very slashery as well as body horror-y, whilst also being an iconic piece of Japanese cyberpunk. So there's a lot going on. But, in your question, what counts as body horror and what's the first thing that pops into my head? It's one of those close-ups on the central character's thigh, I think, is the thing that I picture, where he's tearing it open to jam wires into it.
Oh, gee.
Wow, maybe we should put a warning on this. Probably don't listen to this while you're eating your tea.
Yes. Well, that's the thing about body horror. It's... I think it's strange. There have been times in my life where I feel like, I really want to watch a body horror type film right now. Something very, very, very visceral and physical. But at the same time, a lot of the time that I watch TV and films is while I'm having breakfast, and it's not really going to work. But just because you mentioned cyberpunk, and this is kind of what I wanted this discussion to be, is that things will bounce around. It just triggered in my head a thought that not even occurred to me, but the movie Johnny Mnemonic, the Keanu Reeves movie.
Oh God, yeah.
From the mid-90s. There's a bit in that, I think, where a guy is sliced down the middle, but they do that effect where somebody gets sliced and they don't realise it for a minute, and then they try and move and all fall apart.
Yeah, they go,
Yeah, which is, increasingly common. And that film is not great. I've read the short story, which is pretty good. But that effect is quite memorable.
Absolutely. That happens in, what's it called? The Cube, which is
yes,
one of the worst scripts I've ever listened to. But there's a bit in that where somebody gets sliced up, isn't there? And
Funnily
they don't
enough, I don't remember the dialogue, but go on.
So somebody gets sliced, because all the rooms are like booby traps, aren't they? In the Cube, seem to remember. And somebody gets sliced, like it's not unlike what happens in the first Resident Evil film, where like the lattice goes over the guy and he's basically turned into a lot of tiny pieces.
Yes, it
really freaks me out, that.
It's like a web of lasers in Resident Evil, isn't it? Whereas in Cube, it's like cheese wire.
It's like a big cheese wire mesh.
I remember when I'd just gone to university and I was getting to know one of my housemates, and for some reason we had a video of Cube available and neither of us had seen it before, and that scene that you mentioned is the first scene in the film.
Yeah, it's really scary.
The character just is walking along and there's a kind of whoosh noise. And then blood just starts to come out of him, and then he just cubes to bits. I remember my friend Chris, who I hardly knew at the time, just went, "Whoa, that frightened the life out of me." It's kind of the best bit of the film. Although there is a bit later on where I don't mean to make it sound like I only am interested in the gory bits of the movie, but like you say, maybe the dialogue isn't that memorable.
No.
So it's maybe these scenes which are the best thing. There's a bit later on where they get into another room where there's an acid squirting device, and someone gets acid squirted straight into his face, and it melts through his entire head, and they're all trying to save his life, but they just, there's not much you can do when the entire of his head's melted away. And
that'll do it, won't it?
Yeah, I think he's a goner. But that director Vincenzo Natali, actually, he's a Canadian director who's kind of his films had a sort of sub David Cronenberg style, but still quite good. I like a later movie he made called Splice. Remember that? It's where Sarah
rings a bell.
I think it's on a free streaming channel at the moment. I've recently seen it come up. But it's Sarah Polley and Adrian Brody as DNA scientists who create a new kind of life form, which gradually evolves into a humanoid life form. It's quite good. And then he Vincenzo Natali went on to direct episodes of Hannibal, which is obviously going to come up within the body horror discussion. He has a nice kind of clinical style to him, but I think Cube was possibly written by him, whereas his later films he's just directing them, so maybe he's not a great writer. I don't want to slander him because I've not got my notes. I'm going to check whether he did write it or not in case I've just massively insulted him unnecessarily. But it is fun, and they made a sequel to it, or a couple of sequels in the kind of straight-to-video era, which I think we all miss. Although now it's straight to Netflix, which means that you don't notice them. They just kind of get lost in the wash of...
It was on telly not long ago. I think it was on the Horror Channel while it was still the Horror Channel. It was on telly not long ago, and I started watching it, and I'd not seen it since the first time I saw it in the late 90s. And that's when I was like, "Oh, this script, it's not good." Right. Like all the shocks and all the booby traps were all still fantastic, and you really sort of quite imaginative. But the script was making me grind my teeth a little bit.
Right, oh dear. Well, I've got it in my book here, and it is co-written by Vincenzo Natali, right, okay. So he does deserve blame for that. But I think he stepped away from scripting for his later movies.
Good man. Know your limits.
yeah, absolutely.
So, you asked me what comes into my head when you say body horror. What pops into your head if I say to you body horror?
Well, I suppose it's definitely that 1980s group of movies. It's not really a single film, but it's Cronenberg, specifically The Fly, and also not Dead Ringers, Videodrome.
Yep.
It's The Thing, and I remember at one point I just had this itch where I really wanted to watch some 80s body horror, but the only one available to me was the remake of The Blob from 1986.
Right.
But that's really quite a good one, actually. There's some really gross bits in that, especially there's the death of a character played by what's his name? Dale from The Walking Dead, Jeffrey DeMunn.
Oh yeah,
he's in it, and it's really gross. Which is, I mean, I think the thing I like about body horror is there seems to be something really transgressive about it, because of all the physical violations. It feels kind of, even though horror is kind of built on transgression and wrongness, the physicalizing it puts it on the screen. It's not just, in a way, it takes it away from the audience has got to read into the transgression, like whether you if a slasher movie is showing you the killer's POV, does that make you complicit in the murder? That kind of thing. Whereas when somebody just physically explodes, on screen. It's like, whoa, that shouldn't happen. And sometimes there's there's quite a fun in that. I mean, and I think a lot of the movies put that they kind of articulate that within the movie. So the bit in The Thing, the famous moment where Charles Hallahan's head grows legs and crawls away, and David Clennon sees it running away and says, "You gotta be fucking kidding," which is exactly what the audience is thinking at that point. You know? Also Hellraiser. I think in terms of pure horror genre, I think maybe Hellraiser sort of goes the furthest. It's kind of hard to watch, I think. It still makes me, when I think of just the opening scene where the guy opens the puzzle box for the first time and then the hooks come out of nowhere and slice up his nipples.
Love it.
It makes me go, every time. I haven't seen the remake. I have to say that they've just released a remake of Hellraiser, haven't they? And I've no idea what it's like. I'm intrigued though. Yes, eventually. I mean, I've still seen. There's so many Hellraiser movies. I've only seen 3 of them. Yeah, but
I've only seen the one. Yeah, just the first one.
The first one is the one that I like the most.
Right.
The second one isn't very good at all, but it does have some really interesting visual ideas in it. The third one is kind of a fun romp. I've not seen any of the later ones, all of which went straight to video and kind of increasingly kind of desperate. Like some of them say Clive Barker presents on them, but he really had nothing to do with them. And I understand that a lot of them were like the studio was developing a low-budget horror movie. Suddenly they had the rights to Hellraiser because the rights were going around. So they went, let's just turn this script into a Hellraiser script. Yeah. How? We'll just write about 5 minutes where Pinhead turns up. Yeah. So
put the name on the front of it.
Yeah. So they don't really appeal to me. I do think that in the original Hellraiser, there's an interesting. This is drifting away from the body horror thing. We'll just finish this thought. There's an interesting tack taken with the Cenobites, the kind of demonic angels, that they're neither good nor evil. They just kind of do what they do, and they're interested in the area between pleasure and pain. Whereas I think the later sequels, they do basically become just monsters. So I'm not really as attracted to that. In the first Hellraiser, the monster is not Pinhead or any of the Cenobites. It's Julia, who's a great villainess, you know, who will smash men's brains in to give her undead lover sustenance to rebuild his physical form. You know, I think
why not?
That's a plot. And those effects in which, I mean, the sequence, what is it, where Andy Robinson has just bled in their attic, and a few of his drops of his blood find his way under the floorboards to where the remains of his dead brother Frank are, and then the blood is absorbed by the remains, and then Frank bursts from the floorboards as a kind of half recreated corpse. It's just an incredible sequence, you know. Just for 2 minutes of nothing but Bob Keane's amazing visual effects and also the incredible score on that movie by Christopher Young. And I don't know why the bit where it's like Frank reconstitutes in 2 different bits. Like the brain comes to life over here, and then further on the other side of the floor, like the spine comes to life, and then like the spinal cord reaches over to the brain and shoots and joins it. Somehow that's really gross. I don't quite know why, because it is the opposite of, you know, of what violence in a movie normally is. It's not something being destroyed or a person being violated. It's the coming together of things, and it should be like watching flowers in slow motion bloom, you know. But it's
It's actually very sweet.
So,
Well, that's
yeah,
it. Gross is the key word, isn't it? You know, it's just like, la, 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 la. I don't want to watch that.
Yeah, I mean, I asked our friend Kirsty on the messenger if she had particular body horror highlights. One of the things she mentioned was Slither, the James Gunn movie from 2007. I've not seen that. I guess
me
you
neither.
haven't. So we can't.
Yeah,
really
we're gonna move over that one then.
But it's all about like people turning into slugs or something. So I think that just that concept put me off it, and there is a weird dividing line where sometimes you know, something is too gross, and I'm not. I mean, maybe it's because slugs are already.
They're already gross, aren't they?
Not very nice. Sorry, you know.
No.
What were you going to say there, Stella?
Well, with Slither, when I was reading back over the messages in Messenger, and I thought Kirsty put Shivers.
Oh yeah.
Which is the Cronenberg film. But you know, that counts as body horror as well.
Oh, Shivers definitely does. That's his first film, and that's the one in which people in a Canadian sort of futuristic tower block are all basically raped by weird little slug shit monsters.
Weird little slugs that look like little poos, yeah.
And they all and all the people who've been infected by them turn into like sex crazed zombies.
They do. I remember.
I mean, that's how to make a debut. I mean, you know,
everyone paid attention, didn't they? But I mean, Shivers, aside from the gross little poo worms that make everyone fuck each other all through the film.
Yes.
The context of the film is really interesting, and like all the metaphors and messages that you can read into the film are all really fascinating. But it's like, David, did you have to make it look like a live poo? Did you have to do that? Because all of the commentary on the sexual revolution and sex being political and the pro-choice movement and the liberating nature of the sexual revolution and the little parasites being sort of metaphors for the spread of this new philosophy, and just that one boring white guy being left at the end and he has to succumb to it all. Like, all that's fantastic and I love that. But then it's just like, ugh.
I feel like Cronenberg cannot let us off the hook.
Yeah.
Even when it's, you know, he's like saying, I know you all like sex, but you know it's like basically the same as a virus, right? We're all just, you know.
Cheers, David.
He's big up. I mean, I love that quote. I think it was around the time that he was making Dead Ringers, where he said, I can conceive of a beauty contest where all the models would come up on the stage and then unzip themselves and present their finest organs to be judged. You know, he does seem to kind of see human beings as just meat. Which, I mean,
just meat bags, yeah.
He's very clear-eyed about it in a way. And that theme, well, he's clear-eyed about it, but I think he recognises the unease of it. I mean, I haven't seen his latest film, Crimes of the Future, which ironically is like a remake of his very first short film that he made at university back in the late 60s. Because he's gone away from body horror for a long time, and so his last one was Existence, I think, in '99, which I've still never seen. But now he's come back to it after 2 decades. Yeah, absolutely. But I think I've heard reviewers say that it's maybe a bit too detached now.
Right.
But I think in his earlier films there is a sense of human beings struggling with the idea of who am I? Am I the body or am I the soul? Is, you know, how does it all work? Am I more than just meat? And also there's a sense of self-disgust. There's like the higher aspirations of like a lot of Cronenberg characters are like kind of very high achieving, high highly ambitious scientists and people like that who've got great lofty ideals, but then who are overcome by either their own bodies or, or baser things, and therefore the film's kind of run through with this theme of kind of self-disgust and trying to rise above yourself, but not being able to. Which I think that in a way, it's maybe the timing of Cronenberg's emergence as a filmmaker with the emergence of those kind of visual effects that led to a little moment of perfect cinema. Because if Cronenberg had come around at a different time, his films wouldn't have worked.
No.
And if it hadn't been Cronenberg, I mean, there are other good kind of body horror filmmakers, but probably none that articulate those kind of themes as well as he did, and kind of, because in a lot of non-Cronenberg movies, you might have great body horror sequences. This Tetsuo is another example of a movie that does what Cronenberg does, but most movies just use body horror for a bit of a plot development or two. And that's great fun as well, and or for a shock effect or something.
Yeah, for the shocking bit.
Another one that I really like is the bit in Robocop, where the needlessly violent bit in Robocop, where the guy gets covered in toxic waste.
I love it.
I watched that when I was 7 or so.
And you turned out fine.
And so
the noise that he makes, I will never get the noise of him just going.
Right. I'll put you in the position. Okay, so I was 7. Robocop had just come out on video. I thought, what a fun idea, a robot policeman. I want to watch this.
So bless little Dad.
I got my older brother to get it out from the video shop for me, but he'd already seen it, so he knew what I was in for.
Bastard.
And when that scene came round, bearing in mind that I was already quite traumatised, this is a film that has a man being kneecapped and then blown. It's the bit. Do you remember the bit where Miguel Ferrer gets shot in the knees and then and then Kurtwood Smith does a kind of very sexy pulling the pin out of this hand grenade with his tongue and then leaves the hand grenade on the table and just waves bye-bye, and Miguel Ferrer tries to crawl over to it but can't quite get there fast enough because he's been shot in the legs.
Because he's been shot in the legs, yes.
So I was already quite tender from a whole film's worth of bits like that, and then the toxic waste scene happened. The van crashes into the vat of toxic waste. The back door's open. The guy falls out, rolls along, gets up, starts going, and I just didn't really understand what was supposed to be happening. And I was looking at it and looking at his weird fingers and just not really sure, thinking, is he turning into a monster? What's going on? I don't understand. And then my brother just went, he's melting.
Oh, okay. Your brother's mean. Well, in Robocop, the first time I saw it, I don't remember how old I was, but I reckon I must have been somewhere between 16 and 18, because it was in the period of time where every Saturday night we used to go to the video shop in Hyde, only a few doors down from Dr. Shipman's surgery, I might add.
Right. Wow.
And we'd rent a video. We'd rent a couple of horror films. I know, exactly. And in Robocop, the bit that bothered me the most, and the bit that I still find unsettling, is the first bit in the office where they've got their prototype robot thing, and it starts, and it goes wild, and it shoots, and it just massacres everyone in the office. And I found that moment of everyone unable to get out, and you could get that in a thriller, any kind of film, but they're all stuck in the office, they're all screaming, and they're trying to get out, and it just mows everyone down. That scared the shit out of me, and it really, really bothered me. And it was years and years later that I started to think that moment of being stuck in a place of work or a place of education in America and being shot at happens all the fucking time. And it's like, oh God, that's why that's so unsettling, because that just happens. But the rest of the film I enjoyed, as a piece of sci-fi horror with the gory bits and the melting bit, and it was the rest of the film I enjoyed, but that bit really gave me the heebie-jeebies, as it were.
Do you know the censorship story relating to that scene?
Oh, no, but go on.
So, basically, Paul Verhoeven, the director, wanted that scene to be funny. He was playing it all for laughs.
It wasn't funny.
So, well, let me explain what he's going for. So, when the guns fire, when the Ed 209 fires at the one guy,
yeah,
he shoots at him and he shoots him dead, but then he carries on shooting for ages and basically just reduces the guy's body to absolute mush.
Yeah.
And that's where it becomes funny, because you realise the excess of it. It's like it keeps shooting at him long after he's dead. It just keeps shooting. But the thing is, the American censors went, this is too violent. You've got to cut this down. So they cut it down to the bare minimum, which made it more shocking and not funny anymore.
Yeah.
So, but the director's cut has been released now, and it's on DVD and Blu-ray, and you can see that version of the scene in the film.
Don't think I'll find it funny.
Right.
Well, thank you, censors. You actually made the film, or made that sequence, utterly terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what really disturbs me about that scene, having watched it loads of times? I mean, I do think overall it's quite a funny scene now, but it's the bit when the Ed 209 starts to say, you were in violation of penal code, whatever. You have 20 seconds to comply. So there is a 20-second countdown before it fires.
Yeah, it's so scary.
And during that countdown, everyone in the room realizes that it's going to shoot at him, so they all get away from him. It's like, and he tries to. It's like, help me, and they all push him away. It's like, just get away from me. It's going to shoot you. And the complete lack. Again, it's kind of satirically deliberate. The absolute lack of compassion
so
shown in the room. And then the Dan O'Hurley, the villain from Halloween 3. At the end, he plays the boss, and at the end of that scene, after the violence has stopped, the survivors kind of look up, and he looks at his deputy and says the single line which the actor said was the reason why he signed on to the film. He said, it's the best line of dialogue I've ever had to say. Just after this massacre has occurred, he looks at his second in command and says, Dick, I'm very disappointed.
At which point I'm hiding behind the sofa. Oh God! Yeah.
I think Verhoeven, given his later sci-fi movies, and also which are like Total Recall and Starship Troopers and
I love Total Recall.
I quite like it. I'm not a huge fan, but I've only seen it twice, I think. But
it's not enough.
Again, I mean, it's one of those movies that I know I'm going to watch again. I've recently rewatched Starship Troopers for the first time since it came out. It's on Disney Plus for anyone who wants to check it out, and it's actually cracking. It's much better than I even realised at the time. And again, it just has. I mean, I know it's a space war kind of movie, but it also has like ridiculously violent moments that don't need to be that violent.
Yeah.
Like the bit where a soldier is accidentally shot during a training exercise, and the bullet just goes into his head, and his head basically explodes in a wonderfully, old school practical effect that they had to build like a model head for this kind of thing.
What is it in Scanners with the?
Well, exactly, yeah, and that was kind of the moment where practical makeup effects and Cronenberg came together. I think I read an interview with him where he said that they were preparing to shoot that scene, and a box arrived at his office which had the model head in it, and he opened the box and went, "My God, it looks real!" But I didn't expect it to be this good. And maybe I think that's probably the moment that put him on the path of thinking, I can do stuff with this.
I can do this.
So whereas Cronenberg wants to explore it but also makes you feel uneasy, I think Verhoeven just uses body horror as a kind of fuck you. It's like, by the way, you're massively vulnerable and you're just a bit of skin and bone, and therefore nasty things happen quite randomly, often to quite innocent people in Paul Verhoeven movies. And also that the bit in Robocop that we've just been talking about is another moment like the bit in The Thing where a character on screen gets to react to the gore kind of as the audience do. The melting man is running across the road and the car hits him and he just splooshes over the windshield, and the guy driving the car just goes, "Shit!"
What else are you going to say? Oh no. That's going to leave a stain.
Yeah. Oh dear. So, I mean, what else can we think of? I have to say, in the early 80s there was kind of a low budget underground movement of body horror movies, or specifically Melts movies, and I've never had the courage to watch them probably because of my experience with Robocop. I've always been bothered by the idea of people melting.
Yeah. Stuck with
I did watch an Australian movie called Body Melt, which was early 90s. And the tagline is amazing. If you ever see this DVD in a probably a pound shop or something now, I just found it in, I think, FOP or somewhere like that. Do you remember FOP? I wonder if they're still around. I don't know.
Wonder if they made it.
Yeah. Anyway, the reason I bought the DVD was the tagline, which was Stage 1, hallucinations. Stage 2, organ failure. Stage 3, body melt.
That's quite the jump from hallucinations to organ failure. There's no nausea, fainting, temperature, fever.
That's true.
Hallucinations and then...
hallucinations are probably cheaper to film. I think that's what... Also, the lead actor...
Double exposure will do it.
Is the lead actor in that movie is Harold Bishop from Neighbours. So that was just
before
weird.
Or after Neighbours?
I think during.
Or during?
It's early 90s. And he got...
Had he walked into the sea with amnesia by then?
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Well, I think it was certainly before Harold Bishop's temporary death, because he does come back, doesn't he?
He does come back. Yeah. Didn't think we'd end up at Neighbours.
Yeah.
It's a nice recording.
I knew this body horror discussion would go into some interesting directions. But I'm just looking at my copy of Halliwell's film guide now, because there's a detail about body melt that I just want to read. I just want to make sure I get it right. Because the days when you could just buy film guides and look through them, and there's a title that you've never seen before, and you go, I must see that eventually. And this happened with Body Melt.
We've got one downstairs, a film guide, and what it does in our house is our front room curtains aren't quite big enough. So our film guide, sort of, when you close the curtains, you put the film guide on top of the curtain on the windowsill to kind of jam it closed. So that's what the film guide is used for in my house, and a massive thesaurus on the other side.
To be fair, the good film guides were door stops.
It's huge. Keeps my curtains closed, stops me getting a draft.
Halliwell's film guide stopped being published in, I think, 2006, and they were even saying then they can't make it any bigger. So every time they brought out a new edition, they had to eliminate like 100 or 1,000 films in order to include the last year's crop of movies. So it was just not working.
And how do you choose?
Yeah, exactly. There's an omitted films list. Here we are, Body Melt.
Right.
Yeah, so it's like you get a list at the start of the book which says these films are not in this book. So it's like they've gone through all the annals of films and selected like the 1,000 films that people will find least interesting and eliminated them. But yeah, so Body Melt, it's an Australian film from 1993, written by Philip Brophy and Rod Bishop and directed by Philip Brophy. The lead actor is Ian Smith. That's Harold Bishop.
Is it?
But he says here, just as a note, just like an interesting note of trivia, it says, the film's credits include the unusual lines, testicles, Philip Brophy, buttocks, Maria Krozik. So, like, I don't know if that means the director was willing to have his own testicles in the film, or whether that means he made the testicles. But either way, I think that's pretty impressive.
I don't know if I want to know the answer. They're your nads. I don't know.
I don't know what happened to Philip Brophy in his career, alas. I hope he ended up doing something fun.
Sounds like he was doing something fun.
Contribute to the cultural discourse at any rate.
And, we've saluted his nutsack this evening. So absolutely.
So we talked a lot about kind of 80s, 90s movie body horror and kind of the beginnings in the 70s with the early Cronenberg and with kind of early kind of gore horror movies, because obviously the 70s is where slashers begin, but also you got things like The Exorcist, which had those, I think, Oscar-nominated makeup effects on Regan, which I mean, the fact that... I can't. It's a while since I've seen the film. I'm sure that I'll rewatch it at some point soon because Ian will make me.
Yes.
But certainly in the book, it's kind of clear that Regan, the girl who's possessed by the demon, she slashes her own face with the edges of the crucifix, which is why her face goes. It's how they create the demonic shape of the face is the kind of welts she makes by slashing her own face. That was probably the first movie to kind of go that far. There's also a movie which has probably been mentioned on this podcast a few times between me and Howard. It's not a great movie, but I do think it's really fascinating. It's called Devil's Rain.
Devil's Rain. Rain as in pouring rain, or rain as in monarch rain?
Pouring rain. The idea is that it's basically it's an American horror movie about satanic cults. It's got John Travolta in it in a very early role, kind of pre-Carrie. But at the end of it, well, actually, throughout the film, a lot of people who've been affected or possessed by Satan, they kind of melt. It's after the devil's finished with them, they just melt away to nothing. Right. And it's kind of 1974 effects, but it's still kind of quite shocking. It's just so weird,
right?
Especially when later in the movie it happens to actors like William Shatner is in it, and Ernest Borgnine. It's quite a weird cast. It's on. Used to be on Horror Channel a lot, so it might turn up on Legend. So it's worth keeping an eye out for. But it's also got. I've definitely said this on the podcast before, but maybe not for several years. So apologies if you already heard this. But it's got one of the greatest credits, which is something like Satanist consultant Dr. Anton M. LaVey, who is the actual head of the Church of Satan in America. I later did some research and realised that the Church of Satan are not literally Satanists. They don't believe in the devil.
No.
They're like an atheistic cult who use the apparel of kind of a reverse Christianity as they're kind of making a point. But he's
they are
actually
quite interesting.
And he's in the film. He plays like one of the main cultists in the movie. So
I need to watch it now. That
clearly
sounds
up for a laugh.
Hilarious. The Devil's Rain. Written it down with my list. I've always got a list.
Hey, no, it's worth checking out. It's weird. It's got a really strange mood to it.
Right.
I do think, it's
in
worth a watch.
From the 70s?
Yeah, 74, I think.
Right.
Or 75. Yeah.
I'll find it.
No, it's good fun. But yeah, if we go kind of outside that sort of 70s to 80s to early 90s thing, what do we think that body horror exists beyond that? Is it entirely tied to those kind of makeup techniques and things? I mean, obviously, I feel like Kirsty will kill me if I don't say this, but the core root of body horror is the core root of nearly all horror, I guess, which is the novel Frankenstein. I mean, that's like the ultimate body horror storyline, isn't it? So that's where it all comes from. But I feel like a lot of the visualizations of that story prior to, well, there isn't a big like 1980s version of Frankenstein, is there? So I don't think there is a really kind of gruesome Frankenstein movie. Even though it's about building a man out of bits of corpses,
dead body parts,
I think most of the movies approach that as kind of slightly surreal. So, you know, like Boris Karloff with his square head and his neck bolts and things. There's a kind of artfulness to the way they do it. And yeah, so in a way we've never had a full on really gruesome Frankenstein. And then when you get to the 90s and you do Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I hope we'll be talking about soon, again that plays off the pathos and the humanity of it. So actually there isn't a lot of body horror in that either. I would like to see the Roger Corman one called Frankenstein Unbound that was made in 1991. I've never seen it. It's got an amazing cast. It's about the plot's incredible. It's John Hurt plays a time traveller who goes back in time and meets Mary Shelley, but somehow also meets Frankenstein. Like the fiction and reality gets mixed together. So it's got like Raoul Julia in it playing Dr. Frankenstein, and then it's got, and I think Bridget Fonda plays Mary Shelley. It's really early 90s and it's really odd.
Sounds an unusual cast.
So I've got to talk about that. I've got to watch that movie so I could talk about it. I've spent 20 years avoiding watching it, but yeah. So that, because it's that period, because it's Roger Corman who's kind of known for disreputable horror, that might be quite a nasty one, but I don't know.
Well, maybe we could do a Frankenstein series.
Oh well, you know, there's no shortage of movies.
No, exactly.
Like, as with Dracula and as with, you know, Sherlock Holmes. I think Frankenstein is like the third member of that select group of characters who've been filmed a million times. Done. Will just never be stopped. They'll never stop filming them.
No.
But so do you think that there is kind of body horror more recently? Do you think what do you think of these days? I'll tell you what, before I let you answer the question that I just asked you, I would just mention we've both talked about The Strain a lot on this podcast, and I do think that that's an example of you know, it's obviously there's a hell of a lot of CG, but the way they do it is quite compelling and woozy, and that brings us on, I think, inevitably to like The Walking Dead, which is kind of full on body horror, but it's obviously CGI. It's all. I mean, the first time I saw The Walking Dead, I couldn't believe how violent it was. You know, you just got
absolutely, we love it,
as we've discussed.
Just kept coming, and they, you know, put a lot of effort into having like the hero zombies, so the ones that you see in close up, and the walkers of the week. So even though the threat of the zombies has gone way to the sidelines in recent years, it's all about the people. They still have at least one a week that is something different about it. So maybe it's melted into the asphalt, or maybe it's waterlogged, or maybe it's kind of part of a tree, or, you know, so there'll be a walker or zombie every week that's got something special about it that is all practical effects, because Nicotero won't let it all be completely CG.
Brilliant.
So yeah, the Walking Dead has done a really good job of keeping it, you know, that the story's gone all over the place, and I would argue that season 9 and season 10 it's gone back to being absolutely on form and being fantastic again. And it's going to end. Right. They've got 6 episodes left. But yeah, they've kept the walkers all looking fantastic. There was 2 things that what I wanted to mention in terms of more contemporary things of body horror. So 2 things to mention, and then 2 other tiny things to point people in the direction of to look at body horror that isn't necessarily in horror. But before I get to that, the first one is a film called Teeth. Have you seen that? That's
I haven't
about
seen it.
The vagina dentata myth.
Yeah,
So-
I get it's another one that I've
it's
been
so
maybe
good.
a little bit tentative, so to speak.
Yes.
I've been freaked out by the whole idea of that one.
Yeah. So the vagina dentata myth. So the myth that the vagina or a vagina could possibly have teeth. So there's this girl, she's called Dawn. She's a member of the Chastity Club in America. Saving yourself for marriage. She goes through puberty. Obviously, there's a lot of horror that deals with the horror of the body and puberty. A lot of werewolf texts deal with this.
Yes.
Carrie, all those things. But she discovers that her vagina does indeed have teeth, and she finds it when she's with her boyfriend, and they're going a little bit further than she would like. She wants them to save themselves for marriage, but he pushes it, and he's raping her essentially. But her vagina does what it needs to do, completely castrates him, and we get a lovely shot of his castrated penis on the floor with him in complete paroxysms of horror. And then I won't spoil the film for you because you've not seen it, Dan, but she goes off with her toothed fanny and goes and she goes on a big mission. And it's a really, really excellent film. The actor who plays Dawn, who plays the central character, plays it completely straight. It's fantastic. It's really worth a watch. And then the other one that I wanted to mention as like a contemporary idea of body horror, and it does link to Verhoeven and the meltingness, is Planet Terror, with all of the viral kind of like zombies, but not like they're covered in boils and pustules, and they're sort of leaking and they're going to themselves as they're wandering around and killing people. And then you've got that nurse, and she ends up with the syringes for fingers. And Cherry, of course, played by Rose McGowan, who we all love, ends up with a leg being a machine gun
leg.
Fucking brilliant. But so, Planet Terror's got loads of body horror in it.
Planet Terror is the Robert Rodriguez's half of the Grindhouse double bill that he and Tarantino made, and they were originally supposed to be released as a double bill, but then the distributors kind of lost faith in that idea and released them both as slightly extended single movies. But in 2007, gosh, so long ago, but it seems quite recent. They did do quite limited screenings of the Grindhouse versions of it, so I saw it in the original cut, which is brilliant because you get the trailers in between the films as well. So you've got a trailer directed by Edgar Wright, and you've got another one directed by Rob Zombie and a few different filmmakers, which are mostly hilarious. But and I just had such a hoot with Planet Terror.
So good. One of my favourite Bruce Willis performances, I would say. I think he's fantastic in it.
Oh, God bless. He's really very funny. He's very funny.
But it's just everyone just plays it straight, don't they? They're just like it's brilliant. And then the last thing I wanted to point to is body horror happening in other places, other genres. And I did write about this in my PhD, was the quite frequent use of body horror in what we would consider medical drama.
Oh, yeah.
So the American drama Nip Tuck, which was one of Ryan Murphy's early vehicles. So Nip Tuck is about plastic surgeons.
Yes, I remember it. I've seen it.
It's very good, but it's got loads of extended sort of surgery sequences, and then we have body horror cropping up in sort of the like crime procedural dramas like Silent Witness, where we've got the corpse on the table and we've got very quite protracted scenes of the body being looked at in good detail while the body tells the story of how it ended up on the examining table in the first place. But they're quite visceral and they're quite gory, and sometimes you see the murder, particularly in Silent Witness you would sometimes see the murder and you see the corpse in situ where it landed, I guess, and then you see it again on the table at the pathology lab. But it's quite visceral, but it's hidden in this veil of straight serious procedural drama, and it's right there.
I mean, so excuse me, dear Ruddy. Silent Witness is like 25 years old this year, but I'm pretty sure I remember that when I mean, it's still going. They've not stopped making it, and I think every episode is available on the BBC iPlayer. It was until recently.
Well, there's something to do this winter. Watch all them.
But I do remember that when it started, it was considered very shocking the amount of detail they went into, and this was like pre-CSI and things like that. It was a very dark for a crime drama. I mean, in the mid-90s, when, the main competition is like Inspector Frost and things like
Midsummer Murders.
Yeah. Oh, dear. Although, Midsummer Murders goes for the comedy death quite a lot, but not for the body horror, sadly.
No.
Although somebody probably who's seen every episode will be able to point us in the direction of one.
Answer on a postcard, and we won't read it.
They will do. Nice one. They will do anything they can to come up with an interesting death. So who knows? But I mean, I've mentioned this to you before. Casualty always used to frighten me very much.
Oh, absolutely scared the shit out of me. I always remember the one with the kid who was in a shell suit and she set herself on fire. And the shell suit melted to her body. That's the sound of her spinning around a room in a shell suit on fire. I can still hear that.
Oh, gee.
That scared me.
Yeah. And then we've already given it a mention, but I think Silent Witness brings us to Hannibal.
Yes,
because they both feature extensive gore, especially Hannibal, obviously. But with Hannibal, with both, it's kind of mostly post-mortem. You don't see a lot of actual violence in Hannibal, as we've discussed on the episodes of that. But what you do get is incredibly baroque, detailed, gruesome, nightmarish kind of death tableau in it.
Staged, and with the camera panning up and down and going back and forth across the stage body repeatedly, and then they stay in the room for a while, just talking about what they're going to do while Will has his visions, little weirdo that he is. Sorry, Kirsty. And they show it to you in good detail, and then they stay in the room. And when they're in the room for the minutes afterwards, sometimes it's still there and it's out of focus, but it's still there at the edge of the frame all the time. Just the arm is still there or whatever, and it's just like, ugh. And for network TV, even in the the height of the horror boom, it was still troubling on network TV. They were still a bit unsure about it, which I talked about in the Hannibal episode, but they don't hold back. And it was kind of cushioning it inside the procedural. Kind of is how they got away with it, by putting it inside the sort of clouding it slightly with the people that are looking at this are the good guys. They're going to get something good out of this. They're going to solve this. We're not just watching, the unhinged murderer do it over and over and over again. Like you said, we don't really see it happen. We just see the aftermath, and the aftermath is done through the lens of the good guys in the procedural drama. You
mentioned werewolves, which made me just think briefly of Dog Soldiers, which obviously we talked about.
My daughter watched that for the first time the other week. It was finally time to let her watch Dog Soldiers.
Oh, fantastic.
She loved it. Loved it.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
It will live forever. Well, yeah. So, which I just want to mention, because although it's not in itself a great body horror example, because you don't really see the werewolf transformations and things like that. But Neil Marshall does end up directing some of the key episodes of Hannibal, just as Vincenzo Natali, who we talked about earlier with Cube, he does as well. And I think it kind of speaks to the sort of generic precision of Hannibal, the show, that they chose kind of the top talents,
absolutely,
the kind of top proven talents, but also clearly gave them a very strict framework to work within, as in, this is Brian Fuller has a vision for how we do this. We don't see the violence. Everything is kind of ornate. And a lot of the times the most disturbing stuff is when it's just an out of focus thing in the background.
Yeah, and it's just still in the room. Yeah. Like the one I always think of is when when Beverly Katz gets sliced and she's put in all those perspex boxes, things, and it's like a Damien Hirst art piece, but they're just in the room for so long and they're just moving around, and because she's in so many slices, like if you watch that scene again, like there's not a shot for minutes where there isn't a bit of one of the slices in shot, and it's just like, oh god, leave the room. I don't want to see this anymore. I liked that character, and Hannibal does the confusing thing that we talked about on our episodes, where there is all this body horror and it is really visceral, but it's also beautiful, so it's troubling, or it looks delicious, and you're like, oh, for God's sake.
because of the way that Beverly Katz is presented, she's been sliced up, but if you look at all the slices from a certain angle, she still looks like herself, and she still looks alive.
Oh.
But
then it's presented as art. It's inviting you to look at it like you would be in a gallery.
And
I don't want to.
and it's brilliant. I guess it's not makeup at this point. It's a brilliant kind of art direction and special effects piece. It looks really like a sliced up person.
It really does.
But it's also and it's beautiful and horrible at the same time, and your eye is drawn to it. I think for listeners who've not heard this before, we have done 2 episodes talking about Hannibal in detail, the first 2 series. We will do an episode soon discussing the 3rd series, which is the one that Neil Marshall works on, and I think we'll have a lot of fun talking about that, because there's some fun stuff there. Although I think we can mention, without spoiling anything, that another element of body horror that's in Hannibal the show and Hannibal the movie is the character of Mason Verger, the guy who sliced off his own face.
Sliced off his own nose and then ate it.
Yes. So in the movie, where he's played by Gary Oldman, that's a Dick Smith makeup design.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Dick Smith who designed the makeup in The Exorcist, came back to do Hannibal. I think that's right. It seems a long time after, but if I'm talking nonsense, please correct me in the comments. But and then in the series of Hannibal, where you get to see Mason as a young man before the disfigurement, but then you see him after it as well, and they do something kind of similar. But in both cases, you've got this kind of cadaverous visage or visage that you get a real good look at, and the actors playing Mason have got to develop a funny way of sort of saying carry lines without having any lips. So it's all kind of like this.
It's like he turns into a Batman villain. That's what it feels like, a comic book villain at that stage. It's fantastic.
Right. I think he is, and he's a great villain actually in every version. Because even in the series of Hannibal, he's played by 2 different actors. And I think he's...
which I didn't bloody notice. I watched it all back to back. It was only when Kirsty said, I was like, huh. Oh yeah, it's 2 different guys. Totally didn't notice.
I'm really glad, because I didn't either until Kirsty said to me. So. Yeah,
and I was watching it for... when I was in the intense book writing period, so I was just episode after episode, watch it. I'm on the clock, and I just I did not notice. So good job on those 2 actors.
Nice. I've just had a random thought of something which is rarely talked about. It's about 10 years old now. Did you ever see Torchwood Miracle Day, the 4th Torchwood series that was kind of the American co-production?
No, Dan.
I thought you might not, but I think you... Anyway, it's got quite a lot of Walking Dead crossover, and...
Is it?
It does, yeah. Lots of the directors are the same.
Oh.
Because it started off in... it was a British co-production, but most of it was done in America. And a lot of and the gore effects in it are done by Nicotero and co. Because the idea in Torchwood Miracle Day, which I think is a really good idea, is that something happens which makes death impossible. Like all over the world, nobody can die. It doesn't matter how injured you are.
Sounds exhausting.
And it's like so the population of the Earth increases very quickly, and it's like, oh my god, there's going to be too many people. Like within like a month, we've got to work out a way of doing this. But there's things in it like there's an FBI agent who gets. Well, they think they're going to kill her, and so they break her neck, but she doesn't die. She ends up walking along, but with her head twisted round backwards. And it's got moments in it like that definitely make you go, "Whew, gee." It's a really great concept, which they kind of run with to a certain extent. It's not very well remembered or well liked, but I mean, there's stuff in it that I think is worth going back to,
worth a mention.
So yeah, that just occurred to me. I think I certainly think the Walking Dead crossover kind of, because it's weird. It kind of falls between fandoms. The sort of Torchwood fans of the Doctor Who fans don't really like it because it was an American co-production. Yeah, it goes away from what they liked. But on the other hand, I do think it's like a sort of locus of lots of different fandoms coming together. Like Ernie Hudson is in it from Ghostbusters, for instance. There's a bunch of Star Trek actors in it. There's like it's a really I can see it as like a sort of locus of like a Rosetta Stone of sort of geekiness, and also it's just a really good idea. It does make you think, wow, it's really important that people keep dying. The first scene of it is they're executing a guy who's a convicted paedophile, and they put the lethal injection in him, and he just won't die. He just sits there screaming because they've because he's got poisons in his veins and stuff.
But it is supposed to hurt. It's not supposed to be painless.
Okay, so Stella and I have just had a bit of a break. It's a few days later now, and we're going to continue this discussion. As I remember, Stella, the last thing that you said before the break, where we were talking about the death penalty or the lethal injection, and you said, yes, it is meant to hurt. And I just want to reassure the listener that we can trust Stella when it comes to this kind of information. Slightly off topic, but but the right kind of mood. So we talked a lot around of kind of body horror from the 80s to now. We brought in The Walking Dead and things like that, and that kind of struck me that an area we'd not covered is talking about the impact of CGI on how body horror was presented in films and TV, because he talked about Stella in The Walking Dead. Greg Nicotero, who's the exec producer, I think, and in charge of the makeup side of things, he's keen to keep a balance between CGI and practical, and I think we're now at a point where that kind of balance is very effective. But when CG first came in the 90s, you had a long period where people would just go, "Hey, CG!" and they do CG everything. And there wasn't that carefully considered balance. I mean, one kind of example of 90s CG gore that I remember quite well is, do you remember a movie called The Relic?
The Relic, yeah, I do.
It's a monster movie set in a New York museum, I think. Like they uncover something and it gets loose in this museum. And there's a scene in it where I was very impressed with it at the time. A soldier is trying to run away from the monster, and it chases him and grabs him, and in one shot it just pulls his head off. And it's really obvious, even at the time it's quite obvious, that, they basically filmed, obviously, the real actor playing the soldier. And then a few frames before his death, they swapped it for a CG animation of the character, and then the head comes off. And it was quite video gamey and not particularly scary. But I was thrilled by it at the time because of the fact that they'd been able to do it all in one shot, which you wouldn't have been able to do pre-CGI, I guess. I think the thing that CGI brings is more seamlessness to visuals, but also, often, certainly in that time period, less realism and less maybe emotional impact because, because it just didn't look very real, even though you could argue to some extent that earlier makeup stuff didn't look very real either. It's a different kind of unreality. But I was wondering, how do you feel like CGI affected that kind of gore stuff? And do you remember some early CG gore that wasn't very good or that was good?
Well, with all the stuff that I've done around it, by done I guess I mean like research and write about, and stuff that I'm sort of aware of in terms of debates around it, because it's usually very much centered in fan culture to argue about CGI and whether it belongs in horror and stuff. And horror kind of, it's sort of fan culture around horror to keep horror as authentic as possible, and a marker of authenticity is practical effects. And lots of fan chatter sort of centres around not really wanting much CGI in there, but sometimes we have it now and it's there and it's pretty good. It's relatively cheap. It's relatively fast to do. And in terms of budgeting and maybe shooting schedules, particularly for horror television, using bits of CG is necessary. But then there'll be certain things that will make a big point of not having any CG in them. So you mentioned Greg Nicotero, and he of course has done Creepshow as a series for Shudder, and lots and lots of their promotional material when they were making the series and when it was out was that they kept pushing this idea of, we're not using any CG, it's all going to be authentic and it's all practical, and lots of the chatter around it and lots of the interviews with cast and crew was all lots of it was about it being a fairly sort of cult horror text, but then also it was we're all really proud to not be using any CG, and it's just like, well, while I do see the need and desire for practical effects, like you said, sometimes they can look just as shonky, and I don't. It's a little bit like how I get mad when people start complaining about remakes before they've even seen them. That it's like, just because something is CG doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be bad, or it's a bad example of horror, or it's not authentic horror. It's just another medium in which to work and create these visual representations of monsters and gore and things like that. And some CG looks good, some CG looks bad, and the majority of CG, people don't even see it. I don't even notice it because it's just there to do other things. So I don't see it as a bad thing. It's a thing that's utilised and sometimes is necessary, particularly if you're on a short shooting schedule. You just can't keep cleaning up all the blood, move all the cameras around and shoot the scene again. You just can't do it. So you have to bring in the CG.
Yeah, I think that's a good argument. I also think that the balance between CG and practical is where it really works.
Yeah.
I mean, like you say, I think you said it can be just as shonky when it's all practical. I certainly think of, a lot of the really impressive 80s sort of body horror movies. Loads of it's amazing, but there is this thing that I think I call like the big head syndrome, where someone's going to suffer a serious head trauma suddenly, so suddenly they've got latex all over their head, and they look about an inch wider around the head, and then something explodes. And in a way, I can see defending it, because when there's a real fleshiness to it, even if it doesn't really look real, there's a kind of you have a physical reaction to it.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa.
Yeah, it's all gooey.
But also the fact that it's kind of the big head or the overstatedness of it helps you to process it. I think it was Brian Yuzna who directed the movie Society and produced the Reanimator films, which are pretty key texts of squishy grossness. So key that I can't believe I didn't mention them when we were talking about this the other day. But he referred to that kind of movie as belonging to something called plastic reality.
Yeah.
So they could use those new makeup techniques and new photography techniques to just create a kind of visual surrealism, which is especially true of like Society, where I think I remember a review in Empire said that characters in Society melt like mozzarella.
Oh.
Which they do, but they also they stay alive and keep talking and things. It's all kind of, in a way, it's got more in common with like the Muppety scenes from like Labyrinth, with loads of little characters all chattering away in their bizarreness, than a lot of kind of more traditional horror stuff, you know. But what you've got, if you combine the practical with the CGI, is you can keep the really good practical stuff, but also you remove the need for the big head. I mean, I think the thing in The Walking Dead is that you will have like a zombie, and it isn't just The Walking Dead, it probably comes from early sort of 2000s era zombie stuff, like the later Romero films might do it, and the remake of Dawn of the Dead and things. You know, you will have a zombie that's clearly played by a real actor, but also half their face is missing. It's like they didn't slice off half the actor's face. So there must, but because the CG and there's obviously real makeup involved as well, and the join is so carefully covered, it works entirely. And still doing things like one of my favourite zombies is in the first episode of The Walking Dead, where I think Rick is walking along and he just sees like half a woman lying near the
Bicycle
street.
Girl. That's what she's called.
Okay, and that's clearly an actor who's underneath the ground. You know, they've dug a little hole in the ground, put her in it. It's just her head and shoulders, and they've attached a body to it. But it works incredibly well. So this it just looks amazing, actually. And they've used CGI so that you can't see if the join was coming through where
you can see some like entrails as well, can't you, hanging out?
Yeah, stuff like that, and it's fantastic. And that's what I think they can do now brilliantly, which kind of has moved the genre forward. I also think it might, for me personally, it might sometimes take away a bit of the fun of some horror, because this connects to the episode Kirsty and I did a while ago about movies we won't see. It's like, if I know a movie has someone's genitals being mutilated in it, for instance, not only do I know that scene's in it, but I also know it's probably going to be pretty convincing now, because of the way they've got used to using these different techniques. So therefore, I suppose kind of French extremity kind of movies like Martyrs and things like that probably fall under the rubric of body horror, because of the amount of physical nastiness there is in them, and things like Audition as well, although it's quite a while ago. And I've kind of avoided them because I think they might be too traumatic. When we were talking about Paul Verhoeven films, for instance, there is a shock factor in the fact that somebody will suddenly get shot in the head and blood goes everywhere. But also there is a split second where you can see, oh, that's not the real person's head. They've just cut to a puppet or something, and that kind of allows you to go, ha ha ha, that's all right. Whereas, I don't know, in a way, I think this is weird because I'm talking about movies that I haven't seen, but I suspect that the technique and the filmmaking has become so good now that I would find some of this stuff a bit too traumatic. But I will go there and you know, make an informed decision about that, but I haven't had the courage to yet.
Maybe when you get older.
Yes, yeah, that's what I've been saying for 41 years, Stella, and I'm not going to stop saying it now.
Well, it's funny that you mention, well, not funny, but you know, it's interesting that you mention the notion of being able to see the join. So there's a study, it's a whole book, Isabel Pinedo's book, Recreational Terror.
Oh, I remember that book.
Yeah. And she talks about, the phrase she uses is rupture in the realism, and she talks about how even with quite extreme body horror, gory effects that are intended to be quite shocking, she was saying that the horror viewer will deal with the horror by either, she said, some people will just cover their face, like cover their eyes, and you know, not turn away from those parts. But another thing that plenty of horror fans do, according to Pinedo, is look for where the cut is, so you can see, okay, now we've gone to the dummy head, now we've gone to the prosthetic arm being chopped off. And she's saying that being able to see the join, or the rupture in the realism, as she calls it, helps the viewer to cope with the horror that they're watching. And as technology has got, well, better or different, or, you know, got more complex or whatever, that rupture is no longer as easy to see. And it was interesting in the study that I did, so I was expanding on what Pinedo was saying, how television as a place for horror was a tricky place to put horror because they didn't want to do anything too visual, couldn't do anything too gory. But when The Walking Dead was doing all of its wonderful stuff, particularly in the early years, they would do, I say they, like the PR team, Nicotero, they would do extensive interviews with the trade press where they'd break down the scenes where something particularly gory was going on. So the scene where Carl is shot in the head and we see like half his eye socket shot out, and they explain really clearly, we did this, and this is where it's Chandler Riggs, and then this is where it's the dummy head, and when Rick's running into the house, that's not the actor, the boy in his arms, that's a dummy. So they were pointing to, in the trade press, here is where the rupture is, here is where the cut is, here is where the prosthetic is, to try and ease the tension of putting this stuff on TV, but sort of drawing back the curtain, I guess, to show how it was done. So giving fans or viewers that little glimpse into how it's all been put together. And that's definitely, you know, that's something that horror fans have always done, always trying to recreate effects and always trying to see, like, where does it go from actor to, you know, to the foam head that they blow up. And it's quite an interesting journey, I thought, that horror has been on, particularly with television, that it used to be that you couldn't show that stuff on TV, and now they are showing that stuff with relish and going, look, and this is how we made it. And it's quite fun to see the journey.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that is part of, you know, TV, unlike cinema, it eats content, doesn't it? You know, the TV channel is on the air for 24 hours a day. Yeah. It's not just a movie in a theatre. And if they want to do a show like The Talking Dead,
yes,
you know, or a supplementary behind-the-scenes show, it's kind of an interesting way of extending the value time of the main show that they've made, isn't it?
And for a lot less money.
Yes. Yeah, because you don't have to go to the trouble of hiding the joins.
Yeah.
You can just sit people in front of a camera and have them talk about exactly where the joins are.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And I think that stuff's really interesting. Always.
Oh, I love it.
I do. We won't go off on a big tangent about this, and I'm glad Ian's not here because he probably would. He'd go on about the Marvel movies. But I know that you love the Marvel movies. I love the Marvel movies, but I get so depressed when I see some of the behind-the-scenes footage.
Yeah.
It's just some actors on a blue screen.
Yeah, there's nothing there.
Sometimes not even wearing the full costume.
Yeah.
You know, Robert Downey Jr. in some jeans.
Yeah.
Playing Iron Man. It's like, oh, no. Oh,
no,
dear.
I want you all to be... I want you in the suit.
So,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
was it you I was talking to? I don't know, maybe not. About how with such expansion of CG, again, it's definitely something like Marvel, it's changing the craft of acting.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
The actors that can't see anything.
Yeah, they've got to be imaginative in a different way, and in a way, it wasn't me. I don't think I said that, but I can agree with that and relate to it. In a way, maybe this is the time of the stage actor. You know, I think about like the character in Avengers: Infinity War, who's Thanos' henchman, who flies around. He's played by a totally unknown actor, and you can't even see his face because he's in prosthetics. But I get the impression he's like an Irish actor, and he's probably done loads of theatre. And if you've done loads of theatre, you're used to just imagining stuff. You have to imagine almost everything. Everything except what's immediately like the desk in front of you. Everything beyond that. The whole world. Whereas actors who've only ever been on screen and are used to, say, acting on a location or something, suddenly they're looking at a tennis ball and being told, right, this is the dinosaur, you know,
or the wolf or werewolf or whatever.
So
it's insane.
But I mean, it's funny because Marvel keeps coming up on this podcast. I remember we talked about it weirdly on one of the Halloween podcasts that we did, but I do think it's a symptomatic of how cinema is changing. You know, you get old school filmmakers like Coppola and Scorsese saying that the Marvel films are not really movies.
Yeah.
And I can sort of understand why they're saying that, because it's not the craft that they know.
I know, so it's just like, settle down, Grandad.
Yeah, but the point is the craft is changing.
Absolutely.
It's kind of a big form of animation now. If you want to set out to be a filmmaker now, but you've got no, no game with animating and things and CG and that, then you're gonna struggle. Just as I would, I've done some filmmaking, but my editing knowledge is very basic. I mean, when I was at film studies at uni, we used a Steenbeck to edit with. We were editing on silent 16mm film, as Kirsty will attest. We edited for each other, and that is the craft that I know and love and respect. But it's not the same anymore, different things are coming in. But that's exciting as well, because it means you don't know what the limits of the genre are or the limits of the form are, and should keep everybody on their toes. But I do think that, maybe there was a point kind of dragging the discussion back to the body horror specifically, but also when CG first came in, there was a kind of a sense where it's like, now we've got CG, we can do anything. Yeah. So therefore we don't have to do anything well. We can just do anything. It's
that question, isn't it? Just because you can.
Yeah.
I mean, you should.
Whereas now I think there's enough experience of the different facets of that it's not going to continue to change, and the horizons of it are not going to expand. But it is that I think people have had sufficient experience that they know how careful they've got to be about testing the boundaries. You can't just write a scene and go, yeah, it'll be fine. Yeah, we can CGI in that flying dragon. It's been done a million times. Yeah, if it is a flying dragon, they probably could say that, actually, because it's been done so often now. But anything kind of beyond that, I think people will be very careful. But the upshot of this is I think that we're in a pretty good place for body horror in terms of the filmmakers, like Torturers, have got loads of implements with which to prod their audience.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that fills me with trepidation. I think I feel a bit.
Be careful what you're watching.
A little bit helpless, yeah.
I was just wondering then, you know how there's that sort of cult-like affection for old special effects that now look, like we said, really shonky, the practical effects that on reflection with maybe, 40 years hindsight, you look at that and think, God, that was bad. Is that going to happen with the first CGIs that they'll have some affection around them?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That's a really good question. I mean, from my point of view, it feels like I just want to say no. Because they're not good enough. But that might be me becoming an old man. People who were a bit younger than us in the 90s and the 2000s and found that work incredibly exciting. I also think of the bit at the end of Blade. Do you remember the ending of Blade where Stephen Dorff turns into a big, weird, inflated blood monster?
Yeah.
It's like...
Yeah, it didn't look good.
It didn't seem to really look that good at the time.
No.
But maybe to younger eyes it was incredibly thrilling and opened vistas. Again, if Ian was here, I'm sure he'd be telling us that his kids don't like CGI stuff. So,
well, they're not allowed, are they? Surely.
Well, not in his household. God damn it! I think they drag him along to Marvel movies. And
Excuse me.
He suffers from a degree of bitterness because of that. They do clearly enjoy it on some level, and actually, that brings us back to the kind of the limits of the body horror thing, because I think what CGI has got really good at now that it never used to be really good at, even on as recently as 10 years ago, is CGI animated full people.
Yeah.
So now you've got like She-Hulk with the She-Hulk and with the Hulk and other characters like that, who are basically just played by actors with loads of spots over them, and their motion captured into creatures who then interact like seamlessly with ordinary sized actors. And I just wonder how those scenes are filmed, and I feel a bit bad for not the actors playing the Hulk or whatever, but the other normal ones around them. It's like, exactly what are you interacting with? What can you see?
Yeah.
Is there like Tatiana Maslany doing the lines, but somebody else holding up a big hand that you can hand to a cup of tea to, or
I don't know. It's mad, isn't it?
And they do it really well, but I feel like if they decide, we can do that a lot, then maybe that could be a problem. Possibly if they're at that threshold already. I mean, I haven't seen all of She-Hulk, but I get the impression that I've heard that they started making that thinking, we can have the Hulk on screen nearly all the time, it'll be fine. And then they sort of got into making it and went, oh dear, we've got like 6 episodes to make. Better start rewriting scenes.
Right.
Could you not be the Hulk almost all of the time, please? So
yeah. Interesting. Yeah. But I think certainly for us, for our generation, because we're millennials,
God damn it, I insist on that title. I am a millennial.
I'm a millennial. It's not what you think it is. It's been interesting because we've been on both sides of the divide, haven't we? We've been online as well. Like we grew up with films with next to no CG, if any at all, and then we've seen it come in. We've seen it get used and abused, and we're maybe seeing it sort of, like you said, reach a plateau where it can work work with practical effects, and in terms of body horror to push it into places that were perhaps wanted to be done but couldn't quite be done, either through cost or through time, to how long it takes to make the effects. But when I was at Grimfest the other week, and I was asking one of the directors if they'd used any CG in a couple of the torture-y scenes, and it said they'd only used CG in one of them because one of the cast had a black eye, and they'd forgot to make up the black eye on the cast member in one of the scenes. Right. They watched it back and they were like, oh fuck, so they had to CG a black eye onto her face. But he said other than that, no, and he was quite adamant that he wanted everything in, as much as possible in his films, to be practical. And I was like, yeah, if you want. Then inside I'm thinking, CG's not that bad though, is it?
Well, like you say, if it's doing something like that as well, the audience is never going to go, oh, that's clearly an effect. And also they could never have got away with that in the pre-CGI age, so they just have had to cut the scene, or they'd have had to not use any shots of that actor because it would ruin everything. So
I need to go back and watch the film now and be like, and see if I can spot the fake black eye.
Oh, can you remember which film it was?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, you must let me know, and maybe I'll seek that out as well.
Yeah, we should watch it and do an episode on it, because it was really enjoyable.
Okay. Well, we are going to do some Grimfest discussions, aren't we? Because I've got access to a few of them. Just for the listener, Stella went along. I meant to go along as well, but was it that I had COVID? No, I didn't have COVID, but there was COVID in the family, and I was not very well, and I just
suspected COVID.
Yeah. I missed out on that one, but God bless Grimfest people. They've sent me some screeners, so
cool.
I will watch some of them, and we'll talk about them in a few weeks' time.
Yeah.
But that's a wonderful point to end on, I think, Stella. That you kind of summed everything up there, really. It's interesting how the filmmaking toolbox changes, and I wonder if we will lose. What did Pinedo call it? The
rupture in the realism.
Yeah, I think. That might be a really good point. That you might need that in order to be able to process it and survive the horror. And will we lose that? But no, I guess probably not, because if people are insisting on practical effects a lot, then you will still have that. But you will also have CG used kind of invisibly around it in the bits which you don't think are even effects. I mean, that's the way it would be if the filmmakers are sensible.
But when have they ever been sensible?
Well, that's true. I mean, if they were sensible still, there won't be filmmakers. We know this. So
we wouldn't be sat here right now.
Yes, absolutely. On that note, then, thank you very much, Stella, and thank you very much, listener, for listening to our ramble about body horror. I hope you found this interesting and enjoyable. And obviously, it's a really wide subject area.
It is.
Undoubtedly, there'll be huge things that we've missed and not mentioned at all. Please let us know your own thoughts, because I think this kind of thing is something that we'll be coming back to, because it runs through so much of what we talk about.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Stan. Well, there we go. So this is Cold Afflicted Dan once again in the present day, to just round out the episode with some recommendations. Hope you enjoyed the discussion there between me and Stella about body horror. As we indicated at the end of the discussion, if there are areas you think we didn't touch on and that are worth covering in later detail, perhaps in a later episode, then please do get in touch and let us know. So normally at the end of the episode we come up with recommendations. So my recommendation is to go to BBC iPlayer if you can, in wherever you are in the world, because iPlayer currently features many horror movies that were obviously broadcast on the BBC over the Halloween period, and they're still there. You've got classics such as The Exorcist and The Omen, Stephen Volk's The Awakening, which I've never seen. It's one of those movies that I'm saving because a Stephen Volk scripted horror movie is a rare treasure. You've got Don't Look Now, an absolute classic of the genre. Weirdly, you've got The Relic, the movie which Stella and I discussed in this discussion just now, so you can check out that CGI decapitation that we talked about and see what you think. With that and The Omen on there at the same time, it's a pretty good selection if you like decapitation. So yeah, that's my recommendation, is to just go to the BBC iPlayer if you can access it in your region, because there is a ton of decent and interesting horror on there. Including, if you haven't seen it, that movie what we've banged on about for 2 years, Rob Savage's Host, usually a Shudder exclusive. It's currently on the iPlayer, so if you haven't seen it, go there immediately and check it out. So next episode then, I'd love to give you a preview, but I can't really. We're recording a couple of different episodes next week, and we're not sure which one will be the one that we release on the Friday. But there will be an episode coming out next Friday, so keep them peeled. There will be something for you. Alright, well, thank you for listening once again, and we'll be back soon. Bye bye.
You have been listening to And Now the Podcast Starts. Produced and released by Ambidextrous Solutions Limited. Presented by Stella Gaynor and T.D. Velasquez. Special thanks to Greg Hume for our original theme music and to Brian Gorman for our original artwork. All dialogue and music clips from films, TV shows, and trailers are used for the purposes of criticism in the spirit of fair dealing as defined in UK law and fair use as defined in US law. No copyright infringement is intended. Please visit our home on the web, www.andnowpodcast.com, for more content and contact details. Or visit our Facebook pages at AndNowPod or at Lee Cushing Pod. Follow us on Twitter at AndNowPodcast or at Lee Cushing Podcast. If you'd like to donate to us, please visit patreon.com/AndNowPodcast. And now the podcast stops. Stella Gaynor.